can start.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Barnett, and I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the penultimate session in our inaugural QUASI seminar series. These seminars are designed as debates on important topics related to social innovation, but our aim isn't to convince you that a certain perspective or answer is correct. We're not here to crown winners, as tempting as that may be. Instead, we want to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying these topics. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, and teachers of the material underlying these debates, we know all too well that too much of the literature focuses on uninteresting questions that only rehash and rename established ideas. It's our sincere hope that by pointing out what's known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, can our research ever improve corporate social and environmental practices? Answering in the affirmative, we have a scholar who's the opposite of awful, talking about Mike Toffel. Countering in the negative, he's the king of the Andes, Andy King. And roaring his way through a safari of contingencies, we got the king of the jungle, Tom Lyon. Finally, making sure we understand where we need to go, not just where we've been. We're so darn lucky to have Wren, Montgomery. Sorry, Montgomery is impossible to rhyme, and no one's going to get a joke about Montgomery wards anymore, so that was what I was stuck with.
But, I'm named after a bird. It was so easy.
Fly your way in. All right, okay. So each in turn will argue their position. As they do so, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. When we get to Wren, she'll synthesize and extend the arguments and offer her own perspective. The open discussion will occur after all four of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that remains thereafter. So let's get the party started. Over to you, non-awful, Mike Toffel.
All right, thank you. I thought I was supposed to convince people, but you said I'm not. So let me share my screen. Good to see you all. It's so fun to participate with a bunch of old friends. We will see how that will affect our discussion. I'm going to share my screen here. I think hopefully you can see that. So I'm in the affirmative, which is yes, of course, academic research can improve corporate social and environmental practices. And I'm going to try and convince you with some examples. I think that should do it. And then I'm going to talk about how to increase the odds that our work improves these practices. All right, so here's some examples. Andy King and Mike Lennox wrote this powerful article back in 2000, Industry Self-Regulation Without Sanctions, which led the chemical industry to improve its responsible care program. Some of you know this work on climate stabilization wedges by Pakala and Sakalau at Princeton. It's widely referred to by policymakers as they think about how to tackle climate change and what are the different levers we have at our disposal. Some colleagues with HBS affiliations or pedigree wrote an important paper showing sustainability alpha, which means you can get more returns from sustainability investments. It's widely referenced by sustainability finance practitioners. Some of my own work, I'm pleased to say, has also had some influence on practice. Some work that I did published in Science showed OSHA inspections in California reduced injuries. That's been referenced by the OSHA director. It's been the subject of congressional testimony, and it's appeared in references in the Federal Register, which is where you refer to studies as you're justifying new regulation. And then my work with Jody Short and others have been cited, presented to and cited by a number of social auditing companies. This is about how to improve social auditing practices. A good number of brands and social auditors have approached us after we've published our work, telling us how that has influenced their practices. As many here, Mike Lennox, Tom Lyon talked about, we can also influence practice not just through peer-reviewed work, but also through engagement as experts. And there's lots of sort of anecdotes along that as well. And of course, why wouldn't sustainability research be able to influence practice? There's plenty of evidence that academic work in other domains have influenced practice, everything from the balanced scorecard or the innovator's dilemma We all know Milton Friedman's work, Jensen and Murphy on and some for good and some for evil in the end, but nonetheless influence practice. There's also evidence of debunking. So the prior work was mostly about showing some findings. I guess the King and Lennox was also a flavor of debunking. Some 2001 and 2000 work and very recent work. So Ken Pucker just published a couple of days ago in HBR, Overselling Sustainability Reporting, with important critiques in that space. Andy King and Ken have written about the dangerous lure of win-win strategies, trying to debunk some of the lofty, kind of glossy so-called research that in turn, isn't actually as robust as we'd hoped. A team wrote about overcoming roadblocks to environmental sustainability, including sort of the need to not get too caught up in guru win-win stories. And of course, lots of debunking, again, outside of sustainability. Some of you may be familiar with the Data Colada blog that does a nice job of helping to teach statistics and econometrics in the service of debunking things that they think are not well done research. Andy King and Goldfarb wrote this nice piece called Scientific Apophenia, I think that's how you pronounce that, in strategic management research. That was published in SMJ recently, again, talking about how as strategic management research is not as solid as we might hope. So lots of examples. I think that pretty much closes the book on the debate, but we'll see what my friends have to say. Let me spend a few minutes talking about what I think are how to increase the odds that our research can indeed improve the corporate, social, and environmental practices out there. So for this, I brainstormed with my wife this morning and we came up with 4 R's. So here they are. So the first R is relevance. So you have to pick a topic that scholars and managers or policymakers care about, or maybe that they should be caring about. You should ground hypotheses in scholarship and reality. And managerial implications ought not be an afterthought tagged on as a necessary paragraph at the end of a paper where you don't really have managerial implications. I talk about this back in 2016 after I gave a keynote in the operations management space. So there's a link to that paper called Enhancing the Practical Relevance of Research, which is all about how do we go about pursuing these objectives. For example, engaging with practitioners when they come on campus as guest speakers for your clubs or for exec ed seminars, or going into practitioner conferences to learn what they are talking about, what issues they have on their minds, not just going to sort of the academic conferences where we are somewhat of an echo chamber of ourselves. So that's relevant. Second one, robust. So this gets to the debunking piece. Much too much research, and now I'm talking about empirical research, is done poorly. Everything from concerns about construct validity, identification, folks using methods that are too unsophisticated, and just as often these days, overly sophisticated, making unstated assumptions, which should be made explicit, should be defended, and one should run sensitivity analysis. A lot of this is covered in the Data Colada newsletter that comes out periodically. Omitting asterisks, a practice SMJ has recently implemented, is not really the solution. We have to improve training of PhD students and faculty alike. The third R, readability. We wrote like normal people before academia, and then most of us decide for some reason it's better to speak in jargon. I don't know why. Examples include phrases like legitimacy, Tom Lyon's favorite word to debunk, endogeneity. So if legitimacy is sociology's hobby horse, endogeneity is economists, not always specifying what they mean. I'll just say scientific apophenia. I had to Google that and I still can't say it right. That's another example. Like, boy, that paper will be so much more impactful if it used words that I knew how to pronounce. This does not, contrary to academic perspectives, make us look smarter. Instead, it makes our work inaccessible, even to scholars outside our narrow field, certainly to the media, and ultimately to practitioners. Much better examples are outside our space. If you read Science Magazine, it has a front matter section called Research in Science Journals, which uses normal language to explain what the science is revealing. New England Journal of Medicine has a perspective section where academics and practitioner doctors get to speak about important issues of the day based on their expertise. The best I could find in our space, at least my space, is SMJ has created a requirement of managerial summaries to sit alongside academic abstracts. That's good, but hardly sufficient. The fourth R, reach or reachable. This is what I refer to as the last mile problem. So supposing you do work that's relevant and robust and readable, how do you get it into the eyes of practitioners? And here's just a laundry list of options that I see us having, all of which are costly in some way, none of which are we trained in. So it requires investment on our own behalf. So you could publish in a crossover journal like HBR, Sloan, Social Science, I forgot what the IR is. This is out of Stanford. I shout out to the Rutgers Business Review, a recently started addition to this list. You can write op-eds. I sometimes write op-eds as a companion piece to try and bring the findings of my work to practice or to the general public. You can try and attract trade journals to write about your work. In our space, there's things like Occupational Health and Safety Online, EHS Today, Environment and Energy News. There's some faculty have created blogs, like UCLA has a global supply chain, Northwestern has an operations room. These are in the operations space. There are bridging conferences you can organize or participate in. There's some that I've helped organize, which brought together EPA and other regulators with scholars to try and identify projects and learn from each other. There's other examples where management and scholars are brought together. Not often enough, but there are examples. You can get your work disseminated by via webinars and podcasts. Here's two examples that we run out of HBR and HBS. There's microsites. I just created a microsite here at HBS on working conditions and supply chains. So trying to get those research insights focused, curated, converted to lay language, and then we're shooting these out to people who work in this space. Of course, we can all have at our own fingertips LinkedIn and Twitter and the communities in which we engage. And LinkedIn's got a ton of managerial domains like sustainability professionals and sustainable brands. B schools and institutes should invest in these skills and reaching out, because this is stuff, it's hard for us all to learn these individually. It's totally inefficient. There are a few tiny programs that are trying to do this. There's one out of Stanford. There's one out of Yale. Those are deep dives. I think you may know folks who've gone through those. They're deep, they require application. They require a ton of time. That's like an extreme if you really want to dive deep into that. Andy Hoffman, for example, at Michigan has done the Stanford program. Huge investment, effective, but not a scalable solution. So we need B schools and institutes to invest in these skills. There are a few institutes that are trying to invest in one or more of these R's, ARCs, which Tom is the current president of, and I'm on, and a bunch of us on this call are associated with. We've been working on the relevance and robustness piece with our annual conferences. There's a newer organization called the Responsible Research for Business and Management Network, or RRBM. They're all about the relevance piece, really. They also talk about robustness, but really their focus so far has been on relevance. How do we encourage doctoral students and faculty to get back to the relevant questions that led so many of us into academia in the first place? So they're working on that, and I'm associated with them as well. So that's sort of my 4 R's. I'll provide these slides to Mike. You can see there's some links here so that you can refer to those materials afterwards if you like. That is it for me. Look forward to the discussion.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Very informative set of resources. And now let's turn it over to Andy for the counter.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. So can everyone see that? Okay, so I'm Andy King. I'm the Allen Questrom Professor of Management at the Questrom School of Business at BU. And I'm taking the no position on can our research improve corporate social and environmental practices? And as Mike has already indicated with his chortling about how easy it was to prove his case, this is by far the hardest one to argue. In fact, prior to this, there was some discussion about whether the wording should be changed to move it away from can to something like on average or so forth. That would be a little bit more of a debate. The belief was that if that happened, I would wipe the floor with everybody. So they moved it back to can to make it a little bit more difficult. So, and it is hard to argue. And the reason it's hard to argue is it's depressing. It denies our hopes that we want to be able to have an impact on the world. It's, as I said, it's gloomy, it's sad. And for those people who've been in this space for a long period of time, you know, it contradicts a lot of what we've worked on. And so to come out and say that we can't do this is to a little bit admit or to suggest that and raises existential kind of questions. And when I'm going to make this argument, and in doing so, though, I don't want to be accusing anyone of bad behavior or not trying or anything like that. This isn't a personal argument. This is a systems level argument. What I'm going to argue is that at a systems level, it's very hard, so hard, it's impossible or very close to impossible to have this positive impact. So first of all, let me clarify what the proposition is. And so it is, can our research improve blah, blah, blah. So by our, I'm assuming we mean management scholars. We're not, you know, just this community of people. And by research, I'm assuming we mean the creation of knowledge, something about justified belief. And then I'm also assuming that we're not implementing these. There's going to have to be a transfer process where the ideas that we generate need to be communicated and used by someone else. And by improve, I mean not just changed, but actually things get better. Welfare is increased because of this. And then finally, you know, social environmental practices, this isn't so critical, but it suggests to me it's sort of the side effects of a company that are being handled here. That's not the main line of the business itself. So, and background reading for today, I suggested three things. One was a book by Daniel Dresner called The Ideas Industry, an article by Brent Goldfarb, Simco and I on learning from testimony, and the article with Ken Pucker that Mike Toffel's already mentioned. The first one, The Ideas Industry, makes the argument that in the last few decades, what scholars do in academia, in the social sciences particular, has shifted from being public intellectuals to thought leaders, where we used to be critical, skeptical, testing, reining in excesses that were produced by less trained people. Now we have switched where we want to be optimistic and advancing untested ideas. And so he decries this. And the second article, the second thing there, the learning from testimony, that's about the difficulty of understanding whether something that you read about research is real or not, and the epistemological problems that raises, the justification you have from learning from it. And then finally, the last one talks about some of the problems created by ill-supported ideas. So that's the question. Can we create knowledge that improves social environmental practice? No is both the default answer and the answer most likely to be true. I actually just added a slide after Mike's presentation, because I note that Mike used a variety of anecdotes to try to disprove the null hypothesis here. What is the null hypothesis here? It is we cannot create. So in order to disprove that null hypothesis, you have to show that our knowledge is related to and hopefully precedes social and environmental practices. A few examples does not demonstrate that because those could be entirely random. What we really need is some systematic evidence that our knowledge is bringing about a result. So you'd have to do something like you have to run a test where you, in 6 months in HBR, you published our knowledge, and then 6 months you published random knowledge from strangers on the street and see whether there'd be an improvement after that, after ours and not after theirs. I think we probably all have a guess about what the answer would be. And so until that, no is the retained position. So I win already on default alone and the lack of anything other than anecdote, which we know leads frequently, Mike, to apophenia, which is the finding of a pattern or seeing of a pattern when none actually exists. So no is the answer also most likely to be true, because we need, in order to have this impact with our knowledge, a whole series of steps, the joint probability of which approximates 0. So we need to produce useful knowledge. Our knowledge needs to be published. Our knowledge needs to be picked up by forums. The user needs to select and understand our knowledge, and the users need to adopt our knowledge appropriately. The probability of that all occurring is so close to 0. That's the best estimate for it. So this comes about from what I call the funnel of knowledge exclusion. Oh, I don't have my video on. I should might have on my video on. And we create some knowledge, and we all, I think, try very hard to create knowledge, but obviously there are going to be cases where we have type 1 errors, just accidents, which where just because of the way frequent statistics work, we think we have a result, we don't. We also create spurious claims. I have done all of that, right? I sometimes say we're in the steroids era of social science and I am a doper. That is definitely the case, and some of what I have produced is knowledge and some of it is not. It's nonsense or notions. Then it goes to publication, and you'll note that I now have increased the number of type 1 errors, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and more of these spurious claims. Then at popularization, there are even more spurious claims, and you notice there are even more than there were at the publication stage. Well, that's because at this stage, something occurs, which I call, why isn't it? There you go. The hyperbolic bullshit injection process, where ideas that actually have never been tested, no empirical research has been done, or perhaps a few anecdotes have been gathered, and then they are stuck right into the popularization stage, and then now reducing in a proportion the number of true ideas that people can adopt. Then those things have to be selected, the person have to observe them, figure out which ones to adopt, and the result is spurious claims and type 1 errors are much more likely to be adopted, so close that is to be certain that we can estimate 0 is the likelihood our knowledge influences anything. And this is exactly, this bullshit injection process is exactly what Daniel Dresner is decrying in that book that I mentioned in the reading. So creating a knowledge, yeah, we all produce a mix of, well, I don't know, I have mix of justified claims, unjustified claims, spurious claims. And, you know, we all have a range of epistemological training. I've done all of these things. You know, p less than 0.05 does not say anything about the truth of the hypothesis, except for every paper out there that's pretty much ever written. That's what they say at the end. We have now shown that X is linked to Y. Not even, you know, you haven't shown anything about that. You've shown about something about what happens in frequency of samples in the future, blah, blah, blah. We don't account for this. Here's another jargon word, though. Though jargon is sometimes, I think, gets a bit, you know, this is just a precise word for what we're talking about here. This is the model uncertainty, the problem that we don't actually know how to measure how the world works. So we estimate aleatoric uncertainty, that is sample or randomness, that's what we do. But we don't think about the fact that we don't know which model to measure with. And then we have bad research practices, harking, p-hacking, use of multiple models. And then thought leaders among us seem to lack any understanding of epistemology at all. In working on that paper with Ken Pucker, we interviewed some of these thought leaders, and one said, well, I wrote 18 cases and I have a popular executive program, therefore I'm able to say all these things that I say. And I'm thinking, no, you don't. That's not a justification for having knowledge. Publication, now the problem is, if you think about it, I mean, I think this one is, very convincing in terms of this notion about what happens at the selection process. Most of what we find when we do our research are non-findings. X is not related to Y. Those never get published. So most of our knowledge, our true knowledge, is filtered out. So what we end up having are the interesting findings. And the interesting findings, even though many people read that's interesting when they're PhD students, that's the wrong advice, or the wrong publication rule anyway. The reason that you publish a paper that says female hurricanes kill more people than male hurricanes is because it's so counterintuitive. Well, if it's counterintuitive, it's probably wrong. And so that's why Brad DeLong actually wrote a paper about talking about how all economic hypotheses are false. And it's for exactly this reason. The ones that are unlikely are the ones that get tested or get published. The same, you can see that in the relationship between ESG and financial performance in several SMJ papers. It starts out with Sandra Waddick, who's on this call. Then the next paper is that, no, that Sandra's wrong. Then there's a modification. You get this bouncing around each time. It's interesting because it contradicts the previous work. By the way, Sandra, in some research we're doing, you were right, much more right than I think anyone has ever given you credit for. So we'll come back to that. We also, in the literature, there's a large number of false findings out there that continue to gather sites after sites after years. Some of the most cited in our most prestigious journals. Mike Toffel, despite his happy appearance, has tried to go on the dark side and have these repealed at these journals without success. Brent Goldfarbus and I estimated that 20–40% of published findings are type 1 errors. At the popularization stage, this gets much worse. Try publishing something in the New York Times that says, well, it's not really that way, or it's uncertain. Good luck. What gets published are happy, positive, very forceful findings. And Mike, I know that you are talking about this ability to reach out to practitioners. That's partially because at Harvard you have the megaphone. The rest of us don't have the megaphone. So at Harvard you've got the HBR, you've got all these people supporting you. It's much more difficult elsewhere. Finally, at the selection level, and this goes to this notion of how do readers interpret the testimony that they hear. It's very, very difficult for anyone to read a paper and know whether it's true or not. They can't look deeply at the assumptions that were made and the empirical work that was done. So appealing and bold ideas are more likely to be selected. And thought leaders know this. This is in the paper with Ken Pucker, a quote from a thought leader. And in a somewhat academic journal, he writes, from time to time, innovations have potential to trickle up from poor to rich countries. But when speaking to a more popular audience, it becomes reverse innovation will transform just about every industry, including energy, healthcare, transportation, housing, and consumer products. So even if this was originally based on some very small, weak signal, the claim that then is made in the popular literature is no longer true. It's no longer knowledge. So all of these things need to be done in order for us to have our knowledge adopted and have a positive effect. And you can see each case, we produce useful knowledge, but mixed with false and spurious findings. Our knowledge is published, but selection increased false results. Our knowledge is picked up, but slick notions are more enticing. Users select a knowledge for adoption, but users can't determine what's knowledge, what's nonsense, what are notions. And as a result, the probability of adoption of our knowledge is 0. So you may have some objections at this point, which is, well, the situation is bad, but no harm is done. And or yes, but what can we do? So just to riff off that a little bit, in the paper with Ken, this was my third reading, we go through a series of win-win ideas that have been suggested over the decades. We try to look at what the underlying logic and empirical evidence is. We suggest that they're unsupported, and then we describe how they've actually caused harm into the world. So what can we do? Well, one thing is, I think we can try to go back to being Dresner's public intellectuals. That is, skeptical, cautious. Our job is not, I mean, the other day I heard someone say that business schools now need to produce ideas at the rate of business. And I thought, no, that's exactly what we should not do, because if we produce ideas at the rate of business, we'll produce baloney. And what we need to do is we need to check the business ideas that are being created at that rate and figure out which ones are real and which ones are not. We need to use epistemic uncertainty analysis or model uncertainty analysis, and particularly to test aggregate existing risk and aggregate existing research. And so let me just quickly talk about this. And here, this goes back to the problem that when we report things, we often report them wildly over with a great deal of too much confidence, and probably often wrong. So when we do an empirical study, we enter like a garden, and we have a zillion choices that we can make. We can decide, how to measure this, what's the functional form of that, what kind of control variables use, all these different things. So we wander through the garden and we come out in a spot. But because we came out in that spot does not mean other people will come out in that same spot. And that may not even be reflective of what the overall garden looks like. So what model uncertainty analysis does is you start off, rather than picking a single pathway through the garden, you say, let's figure out what all the plausible pathways are, and let's map them all. And then let's look at that overall pattern. And we've done that on perhaps the most important paper on ESG and financial performance in the last decade. And what you see here, the black line, rank ordered from positive correlation between ESG and financial performance and negative correlation, is the black line is the mean estimate of the beta. The gray is the sample uncertainty. That's what we usually report. And what you see is that the estimate that was reported and has had such an impact is way out on one extreme. And a reasonable interpretation of this is that it's wrong. That really your best guess here is that the relationship between ESG and financial performance is very small. And I want to point out that the uncertainty created by not knowing the right model to use is actually much larger than the uncertainty created by the randomness of the samples that we might have. So while we report that gray stuff, we never talk about the model uncertainty problem. So I think we need to do that. We need to demand that journals require better standards of epistemology and testimony. I think this kind of testimony that I just showed you would be a big step forward. We need to translate for practitioners and write for popular outlets. I'm with Mike on that, but boy, it's hard. And it's particularly hard when you don't have a lot of support and you don't own the outlet. So I think this is something that we do need to work on, but it's an uphill battle. I think we need to speak up about these problems and admit them. And if we do all of those things, well, then maybe we can turn the answer to the proposition of today from no to yes. But as of now, given our system, not given our own personal motivations or skills or whatever, given the system, the answer is no. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So let's now turn it over to Tom to see if maybe there is a viable vaccine for the effects of the hypodermic bullshit injection.
Well, thank you. It's always hard to follow Andy King. So I'm going to take a much lower brow approach. But I love the hyperbolic B injection. I don't know for public use whether we should call it baloney injection or bleach injection, just to make it easier to present. But anyway, let me try to share my screen. Okay, is that working? Okay, so as we were talking, I actually changed the research question slightly in line with some of Mike and Andy's earlier work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature on does it pay to be green? Mike and Andy very quickly got onto the point that that's kind of a dumb question. It's more interesting to ask when does it pay to be green? So, you know, since I'm supposed to balance the two sides, want to try to ask, when does our research improve corporate, social, and environmental practices? And I think a lot of us have a feeling that's kind of captured in this photo. You know, the world is burning up, and we've got some good advice down here. Wear a mask, wash your hands, social distance, stay safe. And somehow it doesn't seem to be saving us. And so in times like this, I think it's good to remember the advice of Matt Groening. And many of you are too young to even remember this series of cartoons he used to draw about life in hell that featured these cool little rabbits. And poor little Bongo here was a bastard child who only had one ear, and he was frequently punished. But for those of you who are in graduate school, remember to be cheerful and obedient. It helps in many ways. But Matt Groening also had some real advice about, can you expect that your research is going to make a difference? So I think we should just keep that in mind, that that should be our expectation going into this whole business. At the same time, it is very clear, social science, to me anyway, that social science research sometimes does make a difference. I think we all know natural science and engineering research makes a huge difference. Most of us have gotten COVID shots. We're watching this on amazing screens with amazing technological capability. So that clearly makes a difference. The frustration for us is that social science research doesn't seem to make as much difference. But you can find lots of examples where it does. The simplex method has been amazing for solving logistical problems, and there's a whole host of operations techniques that have gone way beyond that. The Chicago School approach to antitrust really has transformed things to the point where now we have excessive monopolies in all kinds of parts of our economy. They've convinced people that consumer surplus is the only appropriate goal of antitrust. Their analysis has really transformed the analysis of vertical restraints. Predatory pricing has been dismissed as almost never possible or profitable. So that's an area where social science research has really, really changed practice. In finance, the Black-Scholes theorem has had a huge impact. It's made billions of dollars for people on Wall Street. And in the world of regulation, we use the tools of auction design for allocating spectrum so that we can all watch webinars like this. So it does make a difference. There's no question about that. But the trick is, and this goes back to Andy King's question, what about social and environmental performance of business? So I think that's an important modifier of this set of concerns. Now, even in this space, there are things that have made a difference. Emissions pricing, for example. Now, the thing about this is the idea goes way back to Alan Kinesi's work at Resources for the Future in 1964. So part of the issue is that it takes a long time for ideas to move from the minds of clever people into practice, but it is in use in various places, such as British Columbia and various EU countries. Similarly, tradable permits. The idea was, to the best of my knowledge, first articulated by David Montgomery in 1972. It's been elaborated and thought through by many subsequent authors. And it's in use in California, at the Reggie market in the northeast part of the US, and in Quebec. And when it comes to voluntary environmental programs, there's been an enormous amount of research that many of us in this call have participated in my view, mostly showing that it doesn't really have much impact. I thought it was kind of humorous that Andy King was invited to offer the no position, since his paper with Mike Lennox is arguably the only paper that's ever made any difference in this space. And it was basically exposing the fact that the chemical industry's responsible care program was a case of hyperbolic bullshit injection. And my understanding is they actually changed the program because it was so embarrassing. So sometimes research does make a difference. And there's a larger literature on voluntary programs, most of which suggests they don't do very much. They do a little bit, but they don't do a lot. And I've been told that that percolated into the Obama administration's decision to emphasize other policy measures more than the use of voluntary environmental programs. So there's a wonderful book many of you are probably familiar with by Fung, Graham, and Weil about full disclosure. When does information make a difference? And one of the key things they conclude, and this is kind of obvious, but users need to have the will and the capacity to improve their choices based on the use of the information. Well, I think that offers us a very valuable clue to thinking about when does our research make a difference in corporate, social, and environmental performance. And I want to go to this literature, this vast, enormous literature, hundreds and hundreds of papers on whether it pays to be green, or does CSP correlate with CFP, as some people like to put it to add a little more jargon to things. So there are many papers. I don't know if this should be Hart. I think the T is hiding under the dollar sign. Hart and Ahuja's 1996 paper, but maybe there are earlier ones too. But there are a ton of papers that find a positive correlation. Most of them suffer from some of the same kinds of methodological problems Andy was talking about. There's been an improvement in recent years with methods. They still suggest a positive causal relationship. Great. I don't really dispute that on average. There's a growing body of work that helps us to identify exactly when it pays to be green, and conversely, when does it pay to be dirty? So think about who's the audience for this knowledge. Apparently, it's companies that aim to maximize profits by using natural resources efficiently and taking the long-term view. So we often disparage companies that are myopic, as we should, and it's just stupid. But there are a lot of stupid things in the world. But this is a very narrow set of improvements that are possible based on offering ideas that can improve eco-efficiency. This has very little to say about how do we achieve a systemic change to actually solve environmental or social problems, especially if the needed change may be costly. So this literature largely avoids that potential tension altogether. Now, suppose we're happy to say, well, all we care about is improving eco-efficiency a little bit for some of these companies that don't want to be myopic. Well, is the business literature precise enough to be of any value in this effort? What if business practice is actually extremely contingent on specifics of time and place and not amenable to broad sweeping generalizations? Well, that leaves us in a situation where management and strategy research may more closely resemble a series of case studies or consulting projects rather than a body of knowledge that's actually cumulative. So we may have helped to create a nice market for consultants who are peddling shared value or green to gold strategies, but maybe we haven't really accomplished a whole lot beyond that. Now, maybe that's good. Maybe these guys really are good at going into a company and helping identify what percentage of value you need to share in order to avoid having your social license taken away. But this goes to our question, what's the theory of change on which we're kind of staking our research? So one theory could be, if we just inform managers about their social and environmental impact, they will go out and fix it. Or a refined version of that could be, if we inform managers that they can make more money by fixing their impact, then they'll go out and fix it. An alternative theory of change would be, if we inform regulators of firms' impact, they will go out there and fix it. And this is kind of consistent with some of the work that Mike Toffel was talking about before. Regulators might listen. Fourth, we might inform activists of firms' impact, in which case they will go out and pressure firms to change. So most of the management literature in this domain, in my view, has focused on number two. If only we can show managers that they can make a little bit more money by being a little greener, cool, maybe they will do something. Well, in my view, that's a very, very small box that we're aiming for. You know, at best, that's going to enhance eco-efficiency, but it's never going to come close to causing the systemic changes that we need. If we think we need systemic change to avoid the planet burning up, we need to focus on what will actually inform regulators and activists of firms' impact. And maybe then they will take action. They might ignore us too, but at least we have a shot at systemic change that way. So what needs to be true for impact? You need users to have the will and capacity to improve their choices. As long as business decisions are driven by profit maximization, which I would argue they primarily are, simple old basic economics 101, then those choices are going to be driven by eco-efficiency, eliminating waste, which is good. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't go far enough. Beyond that, corporate decisions are going to be driven by public pressure and regulation. So if we're banking on companies sacrificing profits to improve social and environmental performance, you have to ask, what are you people smoking? Or maybe what sort of hyperbolic bullshit injection did you suffer? So if we're worried about the management literature on sustainability having little impact, which I think is what motivates this conversation, I think there's several reasons. One, we're much better at explaining business phenomena after the fact than we are at offering actionable solutions. We may even be able to document when it pays to be green at the sector level, for example, but without strong enough predictive power that companies are going to implement our solutions. And that's going to be especially true if business decisions are extremely conditional upon a multitude of specifics of time and place. And going back to Andy King's comment, nobody wants to publish research that is very, very conditional on the specifics of time and place. That's what consultants do. Secondly, we're offering small improvements in eco-efficiency when what's needed are systemic solutions. Maybe we're fiddling while Rome burns. And third, we're preaching to firms that they should unilaterally solve externality problems when what's required is collective action. And in some ways, I think this may be the biggest issue of all. Preaching to managers to go out there and solve a collective action problem borders on the ridiculous, but we do an awful lot of it. So I don't want to leave you with a completely negative set of opinions. So I want to say we do have an audience that actually does listen, that actually does care, and by which we might actually achieve some impact. Duh, it's students. Students sit there and listen to us. They pay us money to hear us share what we think we know. So our research obviously ought to inform what we teach. And I think there's a chance, anyway, that informing students about where business profits come at the expense of social welfare may help them inform ethical judgments, may possibly shape the future corporate political responsibility in which we need companies to engage. Now, corporate political responsibility is a whole other topic, so I'm happy to go into that. But I do think students really, in a lot of ways, are the biggest audience for our research, and we shouldn't necessarily discount things if they are paying attention. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Tom. So now we will bring it over to Wren for the very simple job of bringing it all together.
There we go. Yes, well, some of those just appeared on the fly. So I'm I'm going to leave much of this to you, Mike, but because of course I'm one of the more junior people to be here. So I was wondering why you asked me. At first, I thought it was my excellent cat herding abilities in case these guys got out of control. But they've been fairly well behaved, bullshit injections aside. So, but then I heard it was my practitioner experience that you wanted me to bring to the table, because I think Tom's done a really nice job and everybody's done a great job of summarizing the academic literature. So, so I'm going to do that while trying to draw together some of these things, but I'm sure we'll take the discussion afterwards to do the bulk of that. So I have probably more practitioner experience than a lot of people in academia. I worked in the financial industry through the tech boom and bust, worked in consulting, and also worked at fairly high levels of government. So I've seen a lot of these issues across sectors, and also in politics a lot. So I am actually a professional cat herder if that is necessary. So really, with all of that experience, and I had some fantastic experiences in business, my experience of this has been very head in sand. That we would never expect our research to impact corporate social environmental practices if this was left to corporations alone. So I'm going to focus on some of these other pressures, and Tom sort of stole my thunder a little bit. Thanks, Tom. But yeah, my practitioner experience would be no, this is not going to happen, with a few exceptions which Tom mentioned. So my first question here would sort of be, are we barking up the wrong tree, or are we not barking up enough of the trees? You know, and we talked about those other pillars. Andy, I'm wondering if this Stephanie King is related to you at all, because this was the image I found under barking up the wrong tree. And it reminds me of this interesting balancing act that many people are trying to do in academia between making change and working with business. So I will buy it for you for Christmas if you're not aware of it, Andy. So the first example I want to give is something that I was involved in. Tom mentioned it very briefly, is the BC carbon tax. So this came out of something called the BC Progress Board originally, which was my first job out of my MBA. And so this was a board set up by the governor's office not governors, I'm using US terms, the premier's office in BC. Sorry, David Deephouse. Anyway, the premier's office in BC. So a new premier was elected, Gordon Campbell, and due to some complex things beyond the scope of what we're doing today, there was an interesting coalition of business interests. It's a very, very business friendly party, and environmentalists behind his election. So there was a lot of awareness that BC was sort of falling behind on had a lot of environmental problems. The economy was stumbling, a lot of social problems. And so the point of this board was to move forward on all of those. So benchmark, you know, what was going on around in different sort of competitors, et cetera. So this was a board made up of senior business executives, so CEOs of the top businesses in BC, and the presidents of the 3 universities in the province. So it was a real integration of government, business, and research. And so here's where we really saw bringing a lot of research together. And we're working really actively with academics in the business school and economics, et cetera, to think how can we apply this research to some of these business problems or economic, social, environmental problems. So I think really in many ways a success story, and out of this came the idea of the carbon tax and bringing that in, and business was very much on board. So, you know, my takeaway from this is I think one of the primary success stories that we've seen where academic research has really been used effectively is this multi-pronged approach. So business can be at the table, but if we're expecting business to do this on their own, we're probably barking up the wrong tree. So why is this not moving? There we go. So the second thing I would say, I was telling Mike ahead of time, for some reason I got on a dog theme. I'm blaming Pfizer. I was clearly drugged after my vaccine yesterday. But the only thing harder than changing business practice is apparently adopting a rescue dog in a pandemic. So I'm also have dogs on the brain. But so the second thing I was really stunned by as a practitioner coming into academia is where the impact was expected to happen. So I just assumed I start with this right away, right? Of course, I wanted to make change. So I started as a PhD student and I'm talking to practitioners and giving talks in local government and things like that. My summer research project was on social entrepreneurship before it was really cool. I was being asked to talk everywhere. So clearly I did not get the memo that, you know, we produce the research and then we're expected to have impact and translate it. So when I headed off to do my dissertation, which I did on the Detroit water shutoffs, I was really interested in water crises. And so I entered the field here. The Detroit water shutoffs, for those who haven't heard of them, they made global news, but this was in 2014. They're still ongoing. This is not being totally solved, but 33,000 households in a city of under 1 million were shut off. Their water was disconnected. So I entered the field here about 8 months before that happened. And the UN had passed a human right to water in 2010. So one of my questions in my, ethics approved research thing was, what effect does this human right to water have on your work? And I was talking to everybody. So community groups, activists, NGOs, government, the mayor's office, corporations, et cetera, so major water corporations. And more often than not, or 9 out of 10 times probably, the response I got to my question was, the what? I haven't heard of that, tell me more. So I did not expect to be doing action research, but it turned out I was. And so this paper won a couple of awards in 2016 when it finally came out at Academy, and then last year as well for impact. But really, the bulk of the impact on this paper was done well before 2015. So I was writing for The Conversation, I was doing webinars with the League of Conservation Voters, I was working with the governor's office on what access and affordability meant in the state's water strategy, et cetera. So there were a lot of different pieces, white papers, et cetera. So it's just, I think, my approach as a practitioner and thinking about where impact happens, I think signals some of the different ways we could be approaching this. And of course, that is qualitative research. So Andy will rip me to pieces later, but I'm throwing it out there, Andy. There's different ways to have impact. And of course, having worked in politics too, I would, I am junior, so I won't get too into this, but I do think we have to be cautious. And a lot of people have been speaking about this, and wag the dog, you notice my dog theme, of course, but how is our association with business sort of being used? Are we being used to greenwash, to legitimize practices? And I think sometimes we are. So it's something definitely to look at and be cautious of. But to end on a more positive note, I want to draw some attention to something called the Impact Scholar Community, which started last year out of Academy. It's all junior scholars focused on early career research and engaged scholarship. Started by Sylvia Graywatch, Nicholas Poggioli, who I think is on the call. I saw your name, Nicholas. Shout out, Nicholas is on the market. Grab him, he's awesome. And Garima Sharma. And they've asked me to be on the leadership team recently. So as I was joining this, I was looking through their products, and it struck me that this is a problem that junior scholars are already addressing in many ways. So I noted that the word business hardly showed up at all. So instead, the vision is our research changes how organizations and decision makers think and act, and to foster positive change beyond our immediate research insights. So very interesting to me that that's sort of the direction that the junior scholars, or sort of engaged junior scholars, are going, which seems very different from some of the positions and assumptions that have been made in past. So with that, I know there's tons of discussion that will be happening there, but I think we're all sort of agreeing that we need to look at a few different pillars and have impact maybe at different points in the process. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, there's a lot of great positions, a lot to discuss here. I'm just going to get us started with a question, and then the panelists, you guys can look through the questions and see if there's some that you want to follow up with, or we can open it up more generally, but or give you a chance to respond to each other. But I just want to, just open with a question of, should our research actually matter more to practice? Because, sometimes I'm scared that they actually do take me seriously whenever I publish something. And, we're engaging in a lot of different debates, and there's a lot of disagreement within the literature, and we're putting out ideas and theories. We're not putting out proven facts on a regular basis. And so how would they even know, is there some sort of system? Is journal publication an ample screen? The answer is no. For figuring out that something should have an impact on practice. How would we even figure out where the boundaries of what should matter to practice would be?
Well, Mike, I'll jump in on that a little bit. One of the things I think about a lot is what's the transmission process from academic research to impact? And there are other organizations out there who actually take it as their job to be those intermediaries, and think tanks are one of those big groups. And the one I know the best, and which I think is probably the best think tank out there, is Resources for the Future. And they hire a bunch of serious scholars, they accumulate knowledge, and they try to pass it on to policymakers. So they're not just taking one paper necessarily, they're accumulating a body of knowledge and trying to direct it to people that can use it. And I think even the folks at RFF feel very frustrated a lot of the time in their ability to achieve impact. But there are organizations like that who have exactly that purpose. Now, the sad thing with think tanks, of course, is that there's a vast explosion of them in the last 20 years, many of which are basically hyperbolic bullshit injections. They harbor people that don't have academic degrees, that wouldn't know research if it bit them, and they write basically polemical, ideological pieces. So think tanks are dangerous as well, but these intermediary organizations, I think, are neglected by us. We tell junior scholars they need to get out there and tweet to save the world. And maybe what they need to do is ally with other external organizations to save the world.
Yeah, intriguing. I wonder, ARCs and organizations like that, I wonder if those, kind of are in the intermediary space. But anybody else have any comments on that? Or would you like to go on and, basically either respond to something or pick a question, or I'll pick something if nothing jumps
Yeah, I
out.
think we should go to there's like a million questions in the chat.
A
So,
lot of comments. I'm not sure how many questions there are.
oh, I see. Yeah. Well,
And it would be great if somebody besides us could help sort through those. Like Mike, maybe you can play that role, or I don't know.
Yeah, I'm glad to do
Anybody
that. I
wants
want to first ask you if you have anything that sticks out, and if not, then I'll just.
Well, I don't know. The thing that I think I want to just go back to is that we're talking about solving externality problems, collective action problems by preaching to managers. And I think there's just a fundamental disconnect. These are not the people that we have tasked with solving those problems socially. I mean, we're at a very interesting moment right now where businesses are stepping up to speak out against voter discouragement or suppression laws. And so business is starting to step in and fill a political and public role that it never felt like it had to address in the past. And I think that's largely because our institutions are failing as deeply, and business has been highly complicit in helping create the failure of those institutions. So, my own personal interest right now is how can we get business out of destroying our public institutions, which are the instruments we have for solving collective action problems.
Okay, and I'll point out, a lot of what you guys are talking about is kind of touching on social and environmental stuff, but it's a much bigger, broader thing. You've taken a much bigger swing at it in general about impact, which is interesting. In that broader domain, Nicholas is asking about, we've been hacking at this for a long time, saying that our research doesn't matter. And we go back, Hambrick is the most dominant one, but it's gone back before that. But Nicholas has mentioned his presidential address in 1993. What if the academy actually mattered? Has anything changed since then? And if not, will anything ever change?
I read that piece 5 years ago and can't remember what prescriptions, if any, Hambrick had on how to change things. So I don't know if anyone, Nicholas or others, remember that, but there is a movement now especially with this RRMB, which has in its midst some of the accreditation bodies who are thinking about whether there's something in the accreditation process to insist that business schools should have some dedication to solving real world problems. That might be a change. I think the journals have a big opportunity, and I would say obligation to require some connection to practice. We've got some editors and former editors in the audience here. And again, that's something RBM is thinking about, how do we influence those groups? So I think we need to solve this institutionally. In the meanwhile, we're trying to do it individually, which I think is a worthwhile thing to do. But it's not, buying a Prius is not a substitute for lobbying for climate change regulation.
My comment with respect to what's changed is my feeling about a lot of what's happened is we get these enthusiasms, and those enthusiasms come from a variety of places. Right now, it's in accounting. There's enormous enthusiasm for ESG and financial performance in accounting. And a lot of times those enthusiasms, Hambrick is wrong. It matters, but it matters in the wrong way. They're actually making the world a worse place. And we need to kind of, I mean, it may not be glamorous, but some of what we're doing is we're saying, hang on a minute, that's not quite right. And I think we can have a role there. It's not as exciting as coming up with the world-saving solution, but preventing more bad is not so terrible.
Well,
I just have to chime in on that comment, Andy. I've never been on the Council of Economic Advisors. I've had a bunch of friends that have served in various roles with the CEA, often in the kind of environmental remit. And I remember talking with one of them about his experience, and he was saying, the decisions have to be made incredibly rapidly. You walk in the morning, you think you're going to be doing something, And very, very quickly, you're blown off course because someone says, we need to make a decision on this today. Give us the best research informed information we can so we can make a decision by 5 p.m., which is almost impossible. And he said, what we can do is apply very basic economic reasoning to try to avoid horribly stupid outcomes. So the most they can do is just prevent disasters. It's generally impossible in 8 hours to come up with any kind of great solution.
And it's not as if we don't have tons of studies, we don't have lots of findings, we don't, we can't tell them what to do, and they couldn't find, some potential answer and multiple answers in the literature. But let's try, if we can make this as specific as possible. Is there a research question or two that you think definitely needs to be asked that isn't being asked that you could specify now?
How is regulatory capture achieved?
So the mechanics of regulatory capture.
Yeah.
We
And the
don't know a
problem
lot
is
about that.
What's that?
We don't know a lot about that already.
No, we can't document it because the data are not disclosed. Why are they not disclosed? Because Congress doesn't want them disclosed.
Well, because business doesn't want them disclosed either.
Yeah, they have an unholy
Because-
alliance there.
Because business is government, and government.
I have
is
a
government.
question for the audience, because I've been screaming through these chats. I have a sense that there's a old geezer, young person,
Divide.
I'm the
divide
young,
at this point.
Wren and I are the young ones, just to clarify.
And I'd like to hear from, because I think I'd like to hear from young scholars why we're wrong, just even in orientation or prospect or whatever. I mean, I'll steal your ideas and use them and publish them, but I'd really like to hear about this divide, because we're geezers. I'm a geezer.
How can we all, and we can't all be wrong if we argued opposite sides of an argument. I hope we're not all wrong.
Well, but we
Do you
may
mean
be
why you're
pointed in the
wrong?
wrong direction. I saw things scrolling through about, maybe we're not even working on the right kinds of problems. We may be just irrelevant to a whole group of people on this call.
Yeah, Nicholas has been putting some good comments in there, I noticed, and he's been thinking a lot about this. Don't know if you want to talk, Nicholas. Everybody else seems shy.
Yeah,
Me
Lindsay's
neither.
smiling, but she's not saying
Oh,
anything.
Lindsay, anybody, go ahead.
I mean, Nicholas, you've been talking about the handbrake piece, so I just skimmed it, and
Damn,
I
you're
think
fast.
he called for he called for 4 things. He called for the Academy of Management Executive to be second only to HBR in influence on management thinking. I don't even think Academy of Management Executive exists anymore.
You killed it, Mike. HBR killed it.
Well, whatever. The second thing he's called for is that practitioners should be mixed in with scholars. And that's one of the points that I brought up as well. When's the last time you've been to an Academy of Management session with any practitioners in it, or SMS for that matter? Like exceedingly few.
When I've invited them, so.
Yeah, exceedingly few, right? So third, the Academy should have an award for
Yeah.
practitioner-oriented work. They do now, including an O&E, and
Oh,
but
yeah.
it's pretty, there's a couple of them. I'm not sure that's changing people's influence, but they exist. ARCS has some awards too. And then they want to see the Academy of Management have meetings outside of the US and Canada. They've certainly done that, but it's not obvious to me that that's improving the situation. That may have just worsened things, and they were just spreading this nonsense to other countries. So I feel like he was good at calling out the problem, but I like my slides better than his suggestions on what to do about it.
So I just want to say one thing about the practitioner academic divide. I think it's revealing that practitioners don't tend to find our research very useful. I'm not saying that they always need to. I think there's definitely a place for basic research that is not driven by applied problem, but that there's zero is too strong, that there's very little interest in attending AOM from the practitioner side. And maybe some divisions are different. Maybe the management consulting division is different. In the strategy division, we're working to build career pipelines now between strategy, academia, and practice more, to both build research opportunities, but also to destigmatize the idea that PhDs who don't go into tenure track positions have failed. I think that's a major problem in strategy that can be addressed.
I want to jump in. You said something at the beginning of that about somehow we haven't had or we're not having an impact. I mean, Sandra Waddick wrote a paper, and I don't remember the date of it, but it's the 90s where she shows a link between ESG and financial performance. And you've had a string of papers, and now we have all these papers in accounting, and supposedly $60 trillion or something like that is invested in funds that use ESG as a screen. That's impact. Now, the question is it's impacted Wall Street. It's impacted the profits of some investment managers. Has it done anything good for the world? So we have impact. But the question is, are we moving it in the right direction? I think I fumbled that there a little bit.
We have a couple hands up now, so let's see if we can drag in some more folks. But Maurizio, he's on the young camp.
Yeah, exactly. The kid in town here. So a couple of things. First of all, the last question that you're asking, yes, that type of whatever $60 trillion invested in green finance does matter, simply because CEOs in most companies now can't help but figuring out what they need to do in order to attract funding. Okay, so that's an easy one. But I'm wondering whether we are asking the right question, or at least whether we're looking under the right tree here. And if we have to compare, there was a sure now who pulled out that slide, but comparing ourselves to engineering, medicine, other applied sciences that arguably do have impact. Actually, it's not arguable. They do have impact. The key difference is that they are experimental sciences. Whereas unfortunately, even though last few years have seen a bit of a beginning of us doing some experiments with companies. I'm not talking about labs. I'm not talking about doing simple stuff. I'm talking about really working with companies and doing experiments inside organizations, perhaps even with large numbers and in collective ways, so that we can actually compare across cases and interventions. It seems to me that is the way in which management science can actually have a direct impact. So, it strikes me, and now I'm really curious about getting an opinion from the esteemed panelists here. Why on earth is management not an experimental science? Why is it that we haven't, first of all, learned ourselves, but even, introduced the notion to business that they could actually work with business academia in order to do experiments inside and figure out how to do things, because it's interest to them and it's interest for us, right? It seems to me an obvious win-win, and I'm trying to figure out what the heck is wrong. What's wrong with us? What's wrong with the fact that, even though we've been around for decades and decades, we still haven't really established that should be the obvious, right? It should be a normal practice, just like, what people do in medicine and engineering.
So I can speak. Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So two thoughts. One is I talk to companies all the time nowadays who are intrigued by the idea of experimentation, but are very risk averse. And so, their downside risk of distracting management and of distracting their workers is perceived to be more salient than the potential upside. So it's not symmetric, and they're not really incentivized to learn. So often those conversations go nowhere. I'd say, like, out of 10 conversations where I have companies that they even express an interest, like maybe 1 out of 10 actually leads to sort of a second conversation, and the odds, and that's not like the last of it. So I'd say risk aversion is one. The second is like, there's not the tradition, which is related.
Yeah.
I mean, medicine has a real advantage over us because medical practitioners are themselves trained in experimental methods, right? Doctors know what an experiment is, right? They know what a randomized controlled trial is. That's a totally unique perspective. So our comparison, and I did it myself, comparing New England Journal of Medicine, like it would be wonderful for anyone here who works on healthcare and healthcare management stuff. Like, you are super lucky because you have practitioners who are well steeped in the ideas of experimentation and management practices. We just don't. In every other industry, we just don't. So I'd say risk aversion is the #1 reason.
Well, piling in on that, I think that change is happening, but it's happening in economics more than anywhere else. I mean, you've probably noticed that Esther Duflo got the Nobel Prize for work on randomized control trials. I have 2 colleagues at Michigan in the business economics group who have started a nonprofit company called the Good Business Lab. And what they do is experiments on corporate management, mostly in India where it's cheaper. But some of those things have environmental implications as well as management efficiency implications. So it is happening. But Mike pointed out reasons why it's hard to do. And I think also, just to go back to beating the same tired old horse I'm beating today, that's not going to solve systemic environmental problems. That is not going to solve climate change by doing some experiment on company A, B, C, or D.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say, Tom, too. It's so that we're burning up. Yeah.
Well, may I respond to that? First of all,
Mauricio, I'm just aware of the time, and Elizabeth
Yeah.
Dottie is a practitioner. I just want to make sure that we get her in. I think she'll have a lot to add too. If you don't mind, we can take it offline.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Elizabeth?
Thank you, Wren. Nice to meet you all. And that's a case in point in one of the problems is we don't have enough time to talk about real solutions when the world's burning up because we have to go to another call. So I just want to bring in, as a practitioner and listening to all this and the opening there, Andy King, to, how are we thinking about this that could be done differently. As a practitioner, management consultant, internal change processes for 30 years, my mind first went to, if you want more systems change, to identify the constraint on the system changing. And so I'm really interested in any research that's been done on the constraints on adoption. We imagine it's the profit motive, but there are signs that it's just what you said, Mike, about the distraction, focus, cognitive overload, capacity. That's been a real issue in the companies that I've worked with on keeping promises. And I have a hunch, I'm not an academic, so this is, a risk here, but I have a hunch that the work on the theory of constraints, operations research, identifying the constraint on a system where there's interdependence, and then managing the input to that constraint. So I'm talking about Ellie Goldratt. And if we could manage the throughput, the pressure on that constraint, you could get more throughput. Really, to make this very mechanical. And to me, this has implications for academics in 3 ways. One is the flow of knowledge is actually overloading that constraint. The need to sort through it, even consultants trying to sort through which new ideas should we adopt. And academics differentiating ideas makes it hard for management practitioners to know where to start. And the second one is to subsume other throughput so that they focus on what really works. The second one is maybe research on the constraints would be interesting, and articulating the constraints. I mean, I think that's why I'm excited about the corporate political responsibility. And then pacing the throughput to the way the constraint on the system can absorb it. I suspect that moves us more towards consulting and engagement than new knowledge. So I don't know if those are completely out of the ballpark, but that's what comes to my mind when I think about systems transformation. I'd be very, very welcome chat offline, whatever, any thoughts on those. But that's a outsider's thought.
Thank you. So I also want to just note a couple of questions in the chat. Tiffany asks, why don't we incentivize PhDs to return to practice? And Michelle asked, does the MBA need to be more research-based? I sort of view those as similar. Like, should we be injecting more research skills in our students and then encouraging back into practice? I think for MBAs, to me, that's an easy yes. I think we need to teach them to how to run field experiments, how to interpret data, all that stuff that we kind of typically reserve for doctoral students for some reason. We teach that stuff. We know how to do it with modest success, as I noted earlier. But the basics we can definitely teach. The doctoral student piece is a little bit more tricky, I think, because of the funding model. If the schools are investing, $100,000 or more, with the idea of those people going into academia, I think we could figure out the financing way. Just have like kind of a loan reimbursement model that if you're going into practice, certainly lots more companies who are hiring experimentalists are paying them pretty well. So they could afford to pay back loans to PhD programs, just like MBA students do, if they want a deeper dive. So those are just a couple thoughts on that stream. I'm frantically scrolling. There's like a million points here in this chat.
Yeah.
If I could build off of what Mike just said and link back to Tom, I think a big way that we have an impact on the world is through our students. And part of what we should be teaching our students is critical thinking. The reason I have gotten back into ESG is that I went off and I worked on epistemology for 5 years and then started thinking, oh, it's applicable in this other area that I used to be in. And this issue of like, how do we teach students to be consumers, critical consumers of knowledge, of ideas? That's what we need to do in a business school. But you know what? Business schools are not set up that way. They're set up to sell students a bunch of apparently very useful ideas so that they go out feeling empowered. And it's like we're entertaining them and empowering them for a few years. We're not teaching them to be critical thinkers. And in fact, when I pitched a critical thinking class, it was rejected. And the reason it was rejected is that it was going to make it harder to teach MBA students because they would be more critical in classes, not at BU. Just saying. So this is, we talk about going back to Elizabeth's point about constraints. One constraint is that we're not doing, we got this constraint of the sort of the way business schools have been designed and have evolved. Another constraint to your point is it's Harvard Business Review. That's where all the data, basically most of the impact happens. It happens through Harvard Business Review. And it's hard. It's a very narrow pipe. It's already filled with a lot of stuff from the injection system. And so it's very hard to get things through that little, whatever, you see what I'm saying. And to go to the next place, the Atlantic or all these other kind of places, it's very much more difficult. So 2 things, we need to teach critical thinking. And somehow we need to have a way of synthesizing our knowledge and getting it out there. And it can't be through the HBR.
Andy, I'm curious about your students because mine are so critical now, at least undergrads. You need to teach more undergrads because I had somebody in talking about sustainable meat and they ripped him limb from limb. Every company I bring up, they're like, they're greenwashing. You need 20-year-olds. I'm telling you.
And I believe that there's sometimes
they're thoughtful about it too. So,
okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway.
Let's take one more question. I think Murad, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my video is not getting through. So I've transitioned from being a practitioner to a scholar. And so I feel there is a major difference in the incentive structure. We are supposed to make theoretical contributions. So I don't think in the process of making theoretical contribution, it's very easy for us to start reaching out to practitioners. So just to give you an example, when I transitioned from practitioner to being a scholar, my first paper got rejected because instead of using sales, I used log of sale. So imagine from a practitioner perspective, it's such a useless argument. But for scholars, it's a deeply embedded frame of analytical discourse. So just to from my perspective, I think what we prize the most is the least valuable for practitioners. That's it.
Well, this gets to
I
the
hate to
issue.
say, but you know, the difference between linear and log is really, really important in a lot of cases.
Well, that's true. I mean, it does get it. I don't know the specifics, obviously, but it does speak to the issue of the institutions needing to change, right? Not every journal requires what you're calling a theoretical contribution, right? Some journals do and some journals don't. And you get to choose which sport you're going to play and which co-authors to bring along on that journey with you. So it's not, you don't have to play that sport, but if you do play it, even the people who are the gatekeepers there, I think need to be a little more thoughtful and ensure that many more boxes are ticked, but robustness is a key piece. So again, it could be, as Tom's saying, like maybe that was a real issue that is underappreciated. It's hard to know in the absence.
A fascinating set of observations and discussion, and we've run out of time, but I think the only thing we agreed on was that it's all Harvard's fault. Is that what we figured out?
Certainly the chat seems to hit that. Sheesh.
Yeah.
But can't we conclude that we need more research?
Harvard and Stanford and MIT, I mean, these are places, and Michigan are places where practical relevance is very much in the institutional fabric. Now, historically, it hasn't always been accompanied by robustness, but increasingly so in the modern era. Andy's giggling. I think it is. We can have that as another debate. I'd be happy to talk to anyone about that.
Oh God. Yeah. Is Harvard bad for society? Is that going to be our next debate question? All right. Well, look, a sincere thanks to the panelists for a great debate. Many thanks to all of you for participating. As a reminder, the materials from today's sessions will be posted online soon. We'll send a notice to all registered attendees, and you can find links on the RICSI website, which is at business.rutgers.edu/RICSI, RICSI. Please note that I've set up a Twitter account to use for refinements of any research questions. The Twitter handle is @research_better, and the title is Better Management Research Questions. If you'd like to write a brief summary of any quasi seminar to post on the RICSI website, please get in touch. Another thing to look for is the summer 2022 special issue of Rutgers Business Review, not Harvard Business Review. It's a Rutgers Business Review. It'll be focused on this seminar series, and most of the presenters have agreed to write pieces for it that summarize and extend their debates. In addition, you might be interested in a call for papers for a special issue of Journal of Business Ethics titled Save Our Cities, exploring the intersection of ethics, diversity, and inclusion, and social innovation in revitalizing urban environments. Ted Baker, Brett Gilbert, Green Post, Jeff Robinson, and I are the guest editors, and initial drafts are due on January 17th, 2022. In addition, if you're interested in helping to create the next generation of business faculty, please visit mcnairbusinessscholars.org and sign up to be a mentor. Finally, please do join us for our final seminar in this inaugural series in which we debate the question, can we adequately address corporate reputation? That session will feature Bill Newberry, John Bundy, Naomi Gardberg, and David Deephouse. It's on Friday, May 14th, same bat time, same bat place. Hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
Thanks for organizing, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for.
Thanks.
Are the questions